Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Aw, you're so friendly. How's everybody doing? Yeah? Um, my name is Linnea, and today I want to talk to you all about designing for virtual reality. Are there any of you out there who are thinking about building a game with virtual reality? Great. Are there any of you that have already done that? Great, awesome. Well, I'm in good company today then. So, this talk is a little bit more conceptual, but I would say that I have a few examples here that are going to be really good and grounded. So hopefully that'll be helpful for those of you who are transitioning to developing for virtual reality, or those of you who already are working with virtual reality. Or maybe if you're on the fence, this will be a convincing factor. So a little bit about me first. Like I said, my name is Linnea, and I am a video game developer. I am a creative director at a studio called Neat Corp. We are located in Stockholm, and I've been making games for 10 years. I started with a love of board games and designing board games, and I started my career by working in the simulation field. So at the Institute for Simulation and Training in Orlando, where we did simulations with the military. So really, really old VR tech that, I mean, the tech hasn't changed too much, but it has gotten a lot better. I used to work in AAA. That's what most of my career has been. It has been Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, and Battlefield and Mirror's Edge, and Battlefront. And with Battlefront 2, or Battlefront 1 rather, I got to dip my toes into creating a VR experience with the TIE Fighter, like X-Wing experience. And that was really fun, and it reminded me about how much I love virtual reality. So I decided to quit working with console games, AAA games, and I went back to the indie sector to work with VR. So I work at Neat Corp, and we just released a game called Budget Cuts, which, if you haven't played it, I recommend it. We have a free demo on Steam, but the whole game is out, and it's for room scale VR, and it's super fun. So I don't believe that we will ever regret gaming. Games are consistently providing us with the 4 ingredients that make for a happy and meaningful life: satisfying work, real hope for success, strong social connections, and the chance to become a part of something bigger than ourselves. We get these benefits from our real lives sometimes, but we get them almost every single time we play a good game. These benefits are what positive psychologists call intrinsic rewards. We don't play games to make money, improve our social status, or achieve any external signposts of success. And these intrinsic rewards, studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and UC Berkeley have shown, provide the foundation for optimal human experience. Playing video games with your family is proven to create a stronger family bond and improve behavior in children. Playing video games together is proven to increase your trust in each other and enhance your relationships. Unless you play Overcooked and then you just hate each other. Video games are proven to reduce stress and are even prescribed as treatments for reducing depression and anxiety. Video games are proven to increase neural growth and to encourage creativity and problem solving, especially with children. Many of these elements become strengthened when games are experienced in virtual reality and heightened, but the feeling of immersion and belonging that VR hardware can lend also comes with greater risks of disengagement if certain design aspects are overlooked. And we have seen that happening with a lot of titles that have been ported over to VR. There have been many promises that the VR hardware manufacturers have been trying to deliver on, and that we as developers have become very excited about. Unfortunately, I think many of us have missed the point of what makes VR stand out and makes it truly strong. VR hardware has had a lot of promises. You can finally sit together and play a board game with dynamic reactions to your actions. Like, wow, the board game will shift and change. It's amazing. Even if you're in two separate parts of the world, you can sit together and play board games. But this loses much of what makes sitting together and playing board games with your friends charming and interesting. The ability to see each other's faces, to make eye contact, to bluff, smirk, or smile when making a decisive move. The limiting factors of the hardware end up detracting from much of what makes this experience fun and enthralling, and I believe it misses the mark because of that. You'll finally be able to connect with each other and feel what it's like to stand in another person's shoes, and to some extent this has happened with virtual reality, but by focusing on the interpersonal actions that forge connections, like eye contact, touch, togetherness, rather than the spatial experiences that bring us together, completing tasks together, facing struggle together, conveying information or empathy, perspective taken, or even something as simple as asymmetric helpful tasks. VR hardware companies have set many of us up for failure when it comes to designing compelling experiences. What I'd like to do is talk about a few of those specific areas that I've discovered while building my first designed for VR game. I'd like to begin by talking about context and the designs of the game world. I then want to touch on the choices we make about how to present that world in virtual reality, and how pacing is affected by the immersive effect of VR. Finally, I want to talk about some of the unconventional approaches to fourth wall breaking and playfulness that I think are unique to this early adoption phase of VR hardware. So as designers, we are slaves to two masters, the script and the system. On the one side, you have the plot, the characters, the vision of the creative director, art director, writers, audio managers, etc., which must be conveyed, and it's a major part of selling all the complex game systems to your audience. On the other side, you have the system, the hardware, and the software running on that hardware, and all of the limitations that the hardware brings with it. This by itself is not inherently fun or engaging. It's often off-putting and overwhelming. And sitting between them is you, the game developer. And it's your task to create a context and gameplay which satisfies both the creative vision and the hardware limitations. Now, some of you out there are probably crying foul. Why would a designer worry about story so much? Isn't gameplay the meaningful part of the medium? In many ways, I agree with you. But I think as a designer, story provides the context in which you're going to be building your space. And it offloads a huge amount of teaching about choices, interactions, and mechanics that would otherwise be required to be tutorialized in a context-less game. The largest difference that virtual reality presents to a level designer is the creation of context. By having the player in an intuitive room-scale virtual reality space, or even just immersed in 6 degrees of freedom in virtual reality, much of the context and systems are intrinsic. That is, they are the same rules that we normally have in our real world. For instance, if you move your head left or right, up and down, if you walk around, those movements are translated one-to-one. The same applies to crouching, reaching, and tilting. So many movements and actions that would normally require explanation are simply second nature in virtual reality. The context is also heavily helped by a feeling of physical presence in the world, which creates an implied sense of belonging and immerses the player without much need for exposition on the game's part. However, sometimes when working in virtual reality, context can be the downfall for interaction affordances. In the brilliant and awesome VR title I Expect You to Die by Shell Games, the game is intended to be played seated and forward-facing. All of the levels and missions are contextualized in seated environments or where that makes sense. However, the context can often detrimentally affect your expectations, like in the case of the car bomb level. Have any of you played this mission? So in this mission, you're sitting in the driver's side seat, And at one point, you're asked to get something from the glove compartment, or well, you explore and you're looking into the glove compartment. And if you're actually sitting in a car, what you normally would do is you lean onto the middle armrest in order to reach over to grab the glove compartment. But because you're in a seated VR environment and some people don't have armrests on their chairs, many people have fallen out of their chairs while playing this game. And while the direct focus of interactions are often ones that we understand can be interacted with or cannot, it's the peripheral interactions that become difficult to contextualize in virtual reality. I would argue that story can be divided into two distinct components, context and plot. As a designer, you don't normally define the context at a high level, but you do build it. And as a designer, you don't normally write the plot, but you do fill in all the descriptive details. Each detail you add or direct builds the context of the player's actions. And while mechanics chosen, interactions expected, and gating methods used are all very explicit ways of incorporating narrative and context into the game experience, the backdrop is just as important as big cutscene moments, dialogue trees, and discussed far less often when talking about story in games. The world of Dark Souls, for instance, is rich and immersive, not through the explicit storytelling, but rather the environment and level design. It stands as possibly the best modern example of using traversal and challenge to pace narrative information. All stories have a certain amount of information that needs to be conveyed in order for it to be complete. How this information is presented is not inherent to the story itself. Fairy tales have been told through different media forms in different ways and in different cultures for centuries. The way the content of a story is presented is almost as important as the quality of the story itself. You could, for instance, take all the events of Pulp Fiction and put the whole thing in order, telling the story of all these different characters in a linear chronology. But it would undermine much of what makes the film a classic. While the events are not linear, the way they are presented is arranged so you always have just enough information to understand the flow of the narrative. The editing then elevates the story to be something absolutely special. How is all of this related to level design or VR design or game design? Well, games present a unique set of challenges and opportunities in how a narrative is presented and how interactions are built. We don't have total control over the flow or the environment in which the story is consumed, like a filmmaker does. This makes traditional storytelling inherently different from crafting a video game narrative, as we can't make any of these assumptions. Beyond Two Souls, for instance, is a good example of the challenges mixing traditional storytelling techniques with gameplay systems. The narrative is delivered such that mechanics change drastically between sections, and the player doesn't have the opportunity to develop a sense of ownership over the experience. When we tell stories by embedding it in the world for players to participate in, we shift the balance of the narrative to be implicit, rather than explicit. The narrative becomes distributed. The same is true with virtual reality, but due to the grounded and immersive feeling the player gets, the focus on presentation of interactions and spatial experience is even more important than before. Polyarch's game Moss, which features the adorable mouse Quill, stole our hearts with the charming animations shown early on. It's a beautiful, magical world come to life, and I would argue that its decision to have the player embody a forest spirit that controls Quill from a looming presence above the world is exactly what distances the player and weakens the connection formed by the charming character and magical world. Nearly the exact same context is applied to Odd Raven's Carly and the Reaper Man game, which is also a virtual reality game with platforming elements. But here the player in VR works together with a local cooperative friend who is platforming rather than controlling the platforming character themselves. And the experience is entirely unique and thrilling because of it. Leveraging the strengths of spatial puzzles, solving that VR has with the classic fun of third-person platforming that traditional console games are known for, gives each player their own space to enable and help each other and work together towards a common goal. And it was made in Sweden. Designers craft the moment-to-moment storytelling, When you're building a space, there should be a story or a context in mind, the experience that you want the player to have. In Alchemy Lab's virtual reality, the art direction and context for the game were predetermined by the popular television show Rick and Morty. By being informed by the context with which the player takes on the role of fumbling but often good-natured Morty, they were able to create one of the more immersive and emulative moments in VR, not due to just the reliance of presence and physical belonging afforded by the headsets, but by the types of actions that make the player feel panicked, fumbling, thrown in the deep end, and manipulated to create something potentially unethical for Rick, out of context of his greater goals, which is exactly the role that Morty is given time and time again within the show. So since we're looking at designers as storytellers, I think it's important to identify some of the elements that make a complete story. Since the most stories are centered on clear, identifiable objectives, we don't need to go beyond basic principles of high school drama classes to understand it. So if you boil it down to the basics, we have Freytag's pyramid. Inciting incident, rising action, climactic moment, resolution, to the end. But talking about story structure is all well and good, but how does this tie into the design of a level in a tangible way? Well, if you look at the core building blocks of a level structure or a game structure, they lay out something like this for most games. Objective, a goal is placed before the player. Obstacles, something that stops the player from reaching the objective. Ramping, an increase in the challenge of the obstacles. Reward, the payoff for reaching the goal. This basic cycle of challenges followed by reward forms the core loop of gaming. And each unit serves as an important narrative function in the story the player is building. The presentation of the objective is the inciting incident. It sets the player off on a journey and introduces the important elements of the narrative. The obstacle forms the rising action. Now that the objective is clear, we must overcome the challenge. Through ramping difficulty, these obstacles result in a climactic moment that, once passed, allows the objective to be achieved and the reward granted. This may seem a bit overwrought for something as simple as find the red key, but regardless of how basic the task, all of these elements are needed for the player's story experience to feel complete. Objectives without obstacles or a proper climactic moment are often looked down upon as fetch quests that are done simply to extract the tangible reward at the end, not for the richness of the experience. A good story is always asking and answering questions, keeping the audience engaged and interested. A well-paced game has a similar structure, presenting new objectives just as the old ones are resolved. If there's ever a time when the player has no open questions or objectives in the world, there's no longer a reason for them to proceed forward. This means that the game is a series of tiny stories, all building on top of each other to flesh out the overarching story of the game, creating a mosaic of narrative made up of all game content and player experience. So I like to break down the fundamentals of pacing into threat, tension, and tempo. Threat is the actual danger. Threat can come in many forms, each form having a different feeling of pacing. For example, combat tends to be really frantic and higher paced, much more so than traversing an environment, even though the end result, death, could potentially occur in either situation. Tension I define as perceived danger. Tension occurs from the belief in an unknown danger and can be difficult to achieve. But the result of achieving it can be incredibly immersive. To achieve tension when you don't have the luxury of a well-known license to rely on, you need to show the potential consequences of the threat, or the threat itself in some form. Dead Space does a very good job of building up tension without the player immediately knowing what the threat is. As soon as you board the Ishimura, it's plainly obvious that something is seriously wrong. Tension can also be achieved through a known threat in stealth games. Instead of a fear of the unknown, the tension comes from the fear of being discovered. Games like Metal Gear Solid and Splinter Cell utilize this fear well by forcing the player to engage in tense scenarios with enemies in close proximity. Tempo describes the level of intensity of action. How much concentration is required for the player to achieve their goal? Low-tempo gameplay tends to be that which requires serious thought and contemplation, puzzles, and that type of stuff. High-tempo gameplay is generally gameplay that requires fast actions and split-second decisions. High-tempo action often induces stress or panic, and often at its highest level might be termed frantic. There's always a surefire method of creating high tempo no matter what the situation, and that's by imposing a time limit, or what could be called forced pacing. Zombie encounters tend to be a bell curve. Most encounters are, while boss fights tend to crescendo, increase the tempo continually. Having a different form to the tempo of your pacing is a really interesting way to change the experience of the player. Okay, so we talked about the structure of experience, level design is storytelling, designers are storytellers. And while knowing the fundamentals of pacing is important, it's the way these fundamentals interact with each other, how they're structured, that is truly important. The key to creating a well-paced level and a well-paced game is to provide these moments of action interjected with calm, peaks and valleys, as they're often called. Keeping at a valley for too long can become tedious and lack excitement, while remaining at a peak for too long can desensitize a player to action, to the point where it becomes repetitive and boring. But in order to properly understand just how deep-rooted our need for well-structured pacing is, we need to learn a little bit about cognitive psychology. Okay, so this is a basic diagram of the mammalian human brain. In the front section of the brain, we have the prefrontal cortex, which functions carried out by the prefrontal cortex area are called executive function. Executive function relates to abilities to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, determine good and bad, better, best, same and different. Future consequences of current activities, working towards a defined goal, prediction of outcomes, expectation based on actions, and social control, the ability to suppress urges that, if not suppressed, could lead to socially unacceptable outcomes. Basically everything that we define as human. Then we have the limbic system. It controls the basic emotions, fear, pleasure, anger, and all of the drives, hunger, sex, dominance, care of offspring. In the center is the amygdala, not to be confused by the boss in Bloodborne. This is the alarm of the brain. It works like the connection board for mental and physical elements. If something scary is approaching, the amygdala sends signals to your legs to run the heck away. The most important section to consider, though, is the cerebellum, otherwise known as the lizard brain. It handles motor control, attention, and regulation of fear and pleasure responses. This is the oldest part of the brain, responsible for primitive survival instincts such as aggression and fear, the classic fight or flight, whereas the limbic system is responsible for, among other things, our emotional bonding to other creatures, other humans, such as family members and friends. The stress window of tolerance is a term used to describe the zone of mental arousal in which a person is able to function most effectively. When people are within this zone, they are typically able to readily receive, process, and integrate information, and otherwise respond to demands of daily life without much difficulty. This optimal window was first named such by Dan Siegel. When a person is within their window of tolerance, it's generally the case that they're functioning well and can effectively process stimuli. That person is likely to be able to reflect, think rationally, and make decisions calmly without feeling overwhelmed or withdrawn. However, when a person is experiencing extreme stress, the prefrontal cortex region of the brain completely shuts down, in a manner of speaking, affecting the ability to think rationally and often leading to the development of feelings of dysregulation, which may take the form of chaotic responses or overly rigid ones. In these periods, a person can be said to be outside the window of tolerance. This is generally when I start button mashing. And that's because I'm unable to process stimuli and respond in a rational manner. Most people move between these varying states all the time, from minute to minute and day to day. We experience stress, calm, elation, frustration, and a myriad of other states that put us inside or outside our own window of tolerance. Interacting with the new environment in 360-degree video triggers more memory-writing areas of the brain than does simply observing a familiar environment, like a room in your home. This, to me, supports the old adage about memory. We remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, and 80% of what we personally experience. And I think that's one of the reasons virtual reality is having such a big impact when people play it. There's a lot going on in your brain as it interacts with the world around you. Things like accessing old memories and simultaneously storing new ones, responding to sensory input based on a primal understanding of cause and effect. Virtual reality taps into what your brain thinks it should be seeing and encourages it to fill the gaps. A lot of work is done on the development side with field of view, resolution, feedback, positional sound, and interactivity to simulate as many of these elements as they function in real life as closely as possible. Because of this, in VR, the pacing is often needs to be dramatically reduced from a regular game's perspective, because every element affects the player so much stronger, so much more, due to the sense of presence and belonging. Tense moments become extremely stressful. Calm moments can be serene and emotional. And a sense of victory often feels like the biggest wash of endorphins you've felt in your body since you had your first kiss. It's tough to describe just how strong these feelings in virtual reality are, but the important thing to understand is that your pacing and elements of threat often do not need to be very strong or very dialed up in order for the player to feel motivated. So I just want to talk about budget cuts a little bit in a couple specific cases of mechanics that we discovered. So one of the important things that we needed to solve with virtual reality was the impetus to move, locomotion. We solved this through portals and teleportation, but room scale and tracked VR headsets, Oculus, PlayStation VR, and Vive, all allow a sense of space, a feeling of being within the world, which bridges the gap between our inner impetus to move and our external impetus to move. As often as possible, we tried to take advantage of traditional methods of motivating movement and exploration within budget cuts. We take notes from both classic games and communicate threatening areas and spatial options to the player as simply and as clearly as possible. The joy in this game comes from the feeling of immersion, of that marriage between the real-world haunted house feeling and the fantasy experience of virtual worlds. The advantages of using an intuitive locomotion technique combined with the immersive technology of room-scale VR often leads to quite intense and real moments within the game, which only serves to create even more memorable and meaningful experiences for the player. We looked a lot at architecture or elements of playground design or spatial design when looking for how we wanted to motivate the player to move forward. Because as you're inhabiting a space with your actual body, the impetus to move or the will to explore is very different than if you're separated or distanced by a screen. Hilarity always ensues, of course, when we can give people these fourth wall breaking moments, including one of my favorites, when players are crawling inside roof panels trying to peek down through one of the panels, only to discover that the real world floor does not, in fact, have a hole in it. These moments where we actually heighten the player experience by reminding them that they are not actually in the virtual world of budget cuts is a really interesting and counterintuitive moment that we've tried to capitalize on during the design of our game. We try to use real-world skills and scenarios to break away from the norm of video games when it comes to how we present puzzles, how we indicate threat or safe spaces, how we allow the player and reward interaction, and how we imply tools and mechanics within the game. Playing off of this balance between the player and their immersion in the context of the game world is a really fun way to give the player these aha moments and allow them to draw on inherent real-world skills and techniques without slowing down progress or story with cumbersome explanations of systems. I emphasize the ability for users to understand what the central element is in your content because, in general, subtlety is not rewarded in games. The focus of a player is not on appreciating the scenery, but on playing the game. If you've been meaning to try to convey through your design, it needs to be simple, clear, and digestible. That doesn't mean that it needs to be dumbed down, it just needs to be focused. To focus your design around a dominant feature, you must use it as a measuring stick to judge individual design decisions made throughout development. Each prop, combat moment, lighting setup, etc. should somehow be connected to the dominant feature. By having the details of the design to support a clear central design element, we put them to work conveying this intended experience. A focused design allows us to leverage the fidelity of modern games to create a memorable play space, rather than just a pretty scene. In raw practical terms, it also acts as a good guide for scoping the content you put into a game. If a piece doesn't reinforce the dominant feature, then it's a strong candidate to be cut or used elsewhere. Likewise, if an element is on the chopping block and it would add to your dominant feature, you can make a clear case for keeping it. Let's look at some real-world examples of different dominant features and how they manifest themselves in game design, both in AAA and in VR. COD 4. This is a mission called All Gillied Up. In this level, the player takes the role of Captain Price on a stealth assassination mission. Every single detail of the level is designed to reinforce the fantasy of sneaking behind enemy lines in a ghillie suit, enemies always close at hand. The level has a clear design focus and invests in that goal 100% to create one of the most memorable sequences in the campaign. Since VR is new for so many people, a lot of people who are just getting into the hardware want to get in and explore. They want to play. They want to explore the hardware's capabilities and explore this new sense of immersion. Because of this, I strongly urge physics interactions and mini-games with physics to be strong components in whatever you are designing early on. If you do not include these as the dominant themes in your VR games, a lot of first-time users will be left without that light bulb aha moment of magic that VR gives people the first time they eat a virtual donut and accidentally put the controller in their mouth. That was me. As much as possible, try to have these types of interactions in the beginning of whatever experience or game you design, and allow new VR users to play and explore the hardware before diving into the deep end of anything else. Due to the nature of this new hardware, exploration and curiosity tend to be strong motivators in the game initially. So taking advantage of that impulse and doing everything possible from a design standpoint to not block the player's natural exploration of both the system and the game world will help create a smoothless transition into what is arguably one of the most intuitive gaming spaces. Ultimately, designers build meaningful gameplay through the details they choose to include. Understanding the systems and the environment holistically is key to crafting a compelling experience. The designer enables the creation of player story by determining what elements the story can contain. We humans are hardwired to this experience of peaks and valleys, of periods of stress and periods of calm, to being pushed and pulled through tempo, tension, and threat, to be pulled into a world, to connect, to belong toward a goal with a purpose. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
How do you avoid creating nausea for your players?
Well, there's the main causes of nausea that we have noticed with players is when you expect momentum or movement and you don't get it, right? So if you are sitting in a car and it starts moving and you don't feel it start moving, you get nauseous. The same with like an elevator moving. So for us, we use every single method possible to remove that, right? High frame rate. We don't use systems of locomotion that would give you that inner ear off balance. So we don't use any kind of like natural locomotion or controller implemented locomotion. It's only teleportation or not teleportation. Those are our rule sets. The like downside or the hidden dark side of teleportation is that if you teleport very, very quickly, you can still get nauseous because you still feel like you should have some kind of momentum or inertia, which you then don't experience in the real world. So we solve that by having an arc with a physical ball to our teleportation, which limits the distance and the time in between each teleport. I think that any kind of scenario where you have movement in the virtual world and you're not mimicking that movement in the real world, one-to-one, you're gonna get nausea. And some games have that and it's manageable. Some players can manage being in these virtual VR games with natural locomotion. But I think it's really important to provide options and to design with that in mind, keeping in mind that, you know, a large portion of the player base does get nauseous from natural locomotion. Any other questions? Yes.
What's the major difference in designing for something like a Call of Duty level layout there and then designing something in VR?
I think the largest difference would be, I mean, it depends on like what you're making in VR, obviously. But I'm like, if we take something like Arizona Sunshine as an example, like a similar mechanic system, I think a lot of it is that because you get the feeling of belonging and the feeling of being grounded, the stories that you tell or the context or the spaces that you're in impact you so much more. So with Call of Duty, for instance, you always have to crank everything up to 11, and like, you know, the player is this character who goes on this journey, and everything is so dramatic and over the top, and explosions and stuff is huge in order to connect to the player, to make them feel something, right? But you don't need to do that in VR. You can be quite subtle, which is often better than being over the top, I would say. That's the biggest difference, is like less heavy-handedness, less cranking it up to 11, more clear design focus. Yeah.
So what do you think is the future for VR games? Like, where do you think VR as, like VR games in general are moving? Are they moving towards evolving even more? Or have they kind of found their place already?
No, I think we're just getting started with VR. I think, again, focusing more on spatial design rather than on traditional game design is where we're going to see that strength. I always use the example of Moss and Carly and the Reaper Man because they are two really strong examples of using spatial puzzle design to the strength of VR. So I think that's one of the areas that we're going to see VR moving towards, and I think that that is what is going to help create this feeling of connection and belonging and togetherness that I think VR gives you, because you really, like, if you're playing a VR game, you are yourself, right? That's your motivation. You are there. So it's, I think that feeling of being grounded and being yourself and feeling a sense of belonging to this world creates much stronger empathy with what's happening in the context in the play space. So I think that going forward is going to be extremely strong in VR. I also think AR is going to be pretty huge in the future, but I don't think it's quite there yet. Yeah, I think hardware needs a lot of solutions before AR can like properly take off.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Can you mention some things that you really thought would work when you started that with VR that you quickly realized doesn't work at all?
Oh man, that didn't work at all. I'm trying to think. I'm sure I'll come up with something. Like nothing's coming to mind, but I mean, I know we did have a lot of approaches that didn't quite work initially. What were they though? I don't remember. I think a lot of it for us has been about how to convey information to the player. You know, traditional missions, storytelling, and like, you know, having an NPC that guides you. We really had to like shift that relationship balance quite heavily because we're so used to designing for regular games. I think that was like the biggest difference in approach, was like how we gave missions. And I don't know. I'll think of something. I'll tell you later when I come up with better examples.
Hi.
Yep.
Thank you for the talk. I walked in a little bit late, so I may have, I might, if you've answered the question I've asked, you can answer it very quickly. But how do you feel about design choices where the game might be both virtual, a VR game, and a non-VR game? How different do you feel the solutions can be within the same game? Should a game just be a teleportation only game, or do you think it can be teleportation and VR, and then there's like another solution for people who don't want to play VR? So in other words, is it like like VR only games versus games that do both? How do you feel about that? I'm thinking Resident Evil 7.
So designing a game that is playable both in VR and not, and is still strong in both, basically, that's what you're asking about. For me, personally, if there isn't a reason to have VR in your game, or like if there is no reason for your game to be in VR, don't, is my approach. That's my personal approach and my professional approach, because VR is such a limiting factor. It's really limiting. It has a lot of potential to be immersive, but if you're not gaining anything by being in VR, if the design of the game isn't in some way at its core based around being in VR, you're asking for so much work. And like, it's such a small market too.
And let's say it is, let's say in the case where it makes sense for it to be VR, do you feel like it's not a good direction to go into both?
No, I think it is. I think it is. I think if the game benefits a lot from being in VR, if you gain something by having that spatial connection, or by solving puzzles by moving through a space or belonging there, then it's definitely a really good choice. It's just, I think a lot of people try to, you know, slap their game into VR quickly, and there's really not much reason for it financially or experientially, I think. Yeah.
In terms of popularity, do you think VR games in the future will be able to compete with traditional AAA titles?
My hope is that they won't compete. It'll just be like mobile games. It'll take a different sector, a different type of play. The same with board games. I definitely think that VR is a very strong component to play and connection, and I think that it's going to be quite big in the future. But if that future is 2 years away or 20 years away, it's hard to tell. I think that depends a lot on the next few years and how hardware developers choose to take their sales strategies. I think getting VR kits more readily accessible and not being so reliant on beefy computers is going to be extremely important for the future of VR. And I think that getting more, titles under our belts as designers is going to help us really kind of hone in on creating these experiences where VR really helps you feel connected and grounded to the game. So I think it is going to be pretty big. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working in it. All right, well, I'm going to be outside here afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I cannot wait to play all of your VR games that you will undoubtedly make in the future. Thank you so much.